Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about a really important, which I believe, and I think you do too, aspect of D-Day, the Normandy campaign, part of Operation Overlord. My name is Dr. Mitch Yockelson, a military historian based in the Washington, D.C. area, specifically in Annapolis, Maryland, home of the U.S. Naval Academy. I'm going to talk to you about one of the most important events during World War II, and that was the airborne invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. My talk is going to focus strictly on the Americans who flew behind the beach at Utah in the early morning hours. They preceded the landings of the troops on board the landing craft. 2-year-old John Cornish. I've never met him, but I talked to him on the telephone. He lived in a little village called Upadari, which was really near one of the RAF bases that the C-47s, the aircraft carrying the paratroopers in the early morning hours of June 6, took off from, and John was just 2 years old. He lived in this village. The house I show you in the photo here is not exactly John's house, but it's very typical of the houses near him. And he told me that he got to know some of the American airborne troops, whether they were the paratroopers or even the pilots or some of the mechanics who worked on the C-47s. And he would often stand in front of the house in a little garden with his mom, Mary. Mary worked in the same village at the recreation center. So the troops would walk by when John was out there with his mom, or sometimes he was on his own, and they'd stop and they'd say hello to him, pat him on the head, give him some candy, and then they'd go off on their way. And he was used to the sound of planes flying by when they went off on training missions. So early on June the 5th, he's sound asleep in his bed, and his mom, Mary, comes and wakes him up, and she grabs his hand, and he's sleepy-eyed, and he's rubbing his eyes, and he goes outside, and he sees the planes taking off. It doesn't really mean much to him because, as I mentioned, he's used to seeing the planes fly by. But many, many years later, as he becomes an older young man, his mom explained to him that those were the planes that were leaving for the invasion to spearhead the attack on what would become known as D-Day. And John kind of recognized this because he never saw the paratroopers that he knew. He never saw some of the pilots or the mechanics. They had either gone over to Normandy or they had moved on. And it was a really important moment to him. Wright Bryan, he was a war correspondent for the Atlanta Constitution. The Normandy attack by the airborne was also really important to him. He had been covering the war for a number of years. From Atlanta, he had been friends with Margaret Mitchell, who was the author, of course, of Gone with the Wind, a well-known reporter. He had been assigned by his editor back in Atlanta, who got permission that he would board one of the C-47s and follow it, standing there talking to the paratroopers on the plane as they headed to Normandy. And Wright Bryan becomes important because he is one of the first to report about the D-Day landings. His newspaper article that was published later in the day on June 6 told the world about the airborne. And he explained in great detail what had happened. And from what Wright Bryan tells us is a lot of what became the legend of the airborne. I shouldn't really say legend because it's all factual, but he's the one that really jump-started the story. When he was on the plane, before the plane took off from Greenham Common, he walked around. The paratroopers are really nervously sitting in their metal seats. They're strapped in. and he comes across Private Robert Hillman, and he starts to ask Hillman some questions. And he learns pretty quickly that Hillman from Connecticut, well, his mother works for the Acme Parachute Company, which was one of the contractors for the War Department. And Hillman, who is in the 502nd Paratroop Infantry Regiments, looks up at Brian, who's about 6'5" and he's got to stoop over in the plane, and he says to Wright, Brian, I'm not worried at all because I know that my mom would have packed my parachute carefully. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happens to Hillman afterwards. On the screen here is one of the coolest things I found while researching the paratroopers. This was in the Atlanta History Center, and it was Wright Brian's shorthand notebook. And if you look at it carefully, you can see this is the page. You'll see the name Hillman that's up at the top here. And this is the page that he jotted the notes down with. Many of you already know about the Airborne, but I think it's important to mention the name General Bill Lee from Dunn, North Carolina. He's considered the father of the Airborne, part of the Army Ground Forces. Early on, once the U.S. got in the war, it was Lee's assignment to build up an airborne force to match what the British already had and what the Germans used to some effect already in the war. No one knew exactly how many soldiers would be in the airborne and essentially what their uses. But Lee is honored. The statue that you see here actually is in front of his house in Dunn, North Carolina, which is turned into a museum and well worth visiting. It's not too far from the area off of 95, so easy to get to. As the airborne program started to develop, thanks to Bill Lee, the Army said, okay, we need to start organizing and we need to recruit. If you wanted to become a paratrooper, you got $10 more a day a month. And posters like this that you see in front of you on the screen were placed in post offices in cities, or if you were already in the Army, you might see it in one of your barracks or in the mess hall. And it's a very dramatic image, and it certainly drew the attention of Army soldiers or would-be recruits. So what was it like to become a paratrooper trainee? Well, in most cases, you were sent down to Fort Benning, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, and you had 10 weeks of training. You learned how to march with a heavy pack that had a parachute in it. You learned to jump from a tower like this, which is based on the same tower that you would find in Brooklyn, New York, that dates back to the 1930s for the World's Fair. And then you would eventually learn how to get in and out of a C-47. And then finally, you would do jumps. You would jump during the day, and then you would jump at night. And if you were successful, you got your coveted jump boots and a jump badge. Eventually, the Army Airborne was divided into two divisions. There was the 101st Airborne, which I mentioned briefly when talking about Wright Brian and Robert Hillman. Actually, Bill Lee was initial commander of the 101st Airborne. Problem was, Lee had a bad heart, and while the unit was training in England, Lee suffered a heart attack. He survived, but it was decided that he was not up strength to continue leading the division, and he would be eventually sent back to the United States. Maxwell Taylor was chosen. 45 years old. He was the son of a lawyer, and he was originally in the 82nd Division, which I'll tell you in a moment, became part of the 82nd Airborne. He was selected to command, and he would stay with the 101st throughout the course of the war. The 82nd Originally the 82nd Division, famed for World War I, Alvin York. Eventually, it's redesignated for the Second World War. Omar Bradley commands it for a while. He leaves, gets a promotion, and Matthew Ridgway is appointed as the commander of the 82nd, and he would remain with the unit for most of the war until being promoted himself. I mentioned about Wright Bryan. Well, another important figure in developing the story of the paratroopers is a guy named Barney Oldfield. Nebraska-born, Oldfield is a press agent, and he joins the Army Reserves before the Second World War, and he's assigned to one of the paratrooper infantry regiments. And he would stay with the Airborne for a while, and then eventually, when the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces is organized, which would be led, of course, by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Oldfield goes on to Eisenhower's chief staff. And during the lead up to what would become D-Day, as we all know, originally scheduled for June 5th, but postponed by a day because of the poor weather, Oldfield comes up with an interesting idea, and he proposes this to Eisenhower's staff. He says, why don't we allow reporters to come aboard the planes and jump in with the paratroopers? Now, this is a little bit different than what Wright Bryan did. Wright Bryan would stay on the plane, watch the paratroopers jump in, and then he flew back to Greenham Common, where he was whisked into London, and that's where he filed his story, and that's where we know so much about the paratrooper jumps. What Oldfield had thought, why don't we have these war correspondents, all men, no women. Women were not allowed at the front. They would go through the same kind of training as the paratroopers. 10 weeks. They had to have the right blood pressure. They had to have the right eyesight. And they would jump in with the troops and follow their stories that way. Well, a number of war correspondents signed up, and eventually there would be 8 of them who would jump into Normandy, with most of them with the Americans, although some also jumped in with the British. And in one case, an American by the name of Robert Rubin, who was a war correspondent for Reuters, he jumped in carrying his typewriter tucked inside the strap, and he landed on Normandy. One of the war correspondents actually broke a leg. Rubin landed safely, wrote a story, and found a carrier pigeon, placed it in the carrier pigeon's little basket. The carrier pigeon carried the story across the English Channel and was eventually filed on, I believe, June the 7th. The airborne mission was part of Operation Neptune. Operation Overlord, of course, is the overall mission to get troops into foothold on Fortress Europe, where the Germans had been occupying various villages throughout the continent and cities since 1940. Neptune would be the landing of the troops, primarily the assault troops, onto the 5 beaches, but the airborne fit under Neptune as well. For the 2 American divisions, there were a total of 13,000, split almost evenly between the 82nd and the 101st. Only on Utah Beach did paratroopers drop. And part of that reason is there certainly were not enough paratroopers to also have them land at Omaha Beach. And the mission primarily was to secure the roads and bridges inland from Utah Beach, disrupt the surprised German forces, and it was assumed that the German forces would be surprised. the whole D-Day story was predicated on the fact that the Germans expected the landing to take place elsewhere, not in Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais. So with the paratroopers jumping in the early morning hours, the German forces would be surprised. And then after the paratroopers secured the area around 6:30 a.m., and the paratroopers would drop somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m., about 6:30 a.m., the 4th Infantry Division would land on the beach, and they would link up with the paratroopers. General Eisenhower's staff was composed of both American and British officers. Leading his Allied air forces, which would include the airborne plus all of the bombing missions, was Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, really experienced officer, World War I experience, and Lee Mallory was a no-nonsense guy. He was not in favor at all of landing airborne troops. He felt as though that they were going to be easy targets and easily shot out of the sky. He tried his hardest to convince Eisenhower on more than one occasion to drop the airborne. But Utah Beach, which was the westernmost beach, it was absolutely necessary to have the airborne come in first and secure the beach to allow the 4th Division. Without the airborne, Utah Beach would not have, could not have happened. And Utah overall was essential for linking up with the beach next to it, also going to be manned by Americans, Omaha Beach. So meetings took place in May in the lead up to D-Day, where discussions between the overall ground commander, General Montgomery, the American ground commander, Omar Bradley, as well as Taylor and Ridgway. And they fought vehemently to keep the airborne, and eventually decision lied with Eisenhower, who agreed with them. And after a painful night of thinking about it, smoking a number of cigarettes in his so-called circus tent, which was in a wooded area in Portsmouth, perhaps reading a few of his favorite Western novels, Eisenhower said, yes, we're going to have the airborne, knowing that we could lose a significant number of men. Lee Mallory was thinking it could be upwards of 80% of the airborne might be lost. The airborne had to get to their jump zones, and this would be undertaken by 9th Carrier Command, led by Louis Brereton, commander of the 9th Air Force. The paratroopers would fly over in Douglas C-47s, which were originally commercial airplanes converted into military aircraft. Each of the groups of men were in sticks, usually 17 to 18 men per airplane. And then later on, after the paratroopers dropped, C-47s would tow gliders. The image I have here is of one of the American gliders made by the Waco Aircraft Company from Ohio, the CG-A4. I should say that the coffins were extremely dangerous, mostly made of cloth and wood. Their intention was to fly one mission. And on June 6, the highest ranking officer of any of the Allied commands, a guy named Brigadier General Don Pratt, who was second in command to Maxwell Taylor, was killed that morning when his glider crashed, landed, slid into some trees, and split apart. 97% of the gliders would have some damage. Most of them were unusable again. So what did a paratrooper carry with him? And loading into the C-47s on the evening of June 5th, well, there was the Mae West flotation vise, which, if you know who Mae West is and you know the sort of caricature of her, the life vest, one would expand, kind of look like her. They had to have maps once they landed. There were hand grenades. They had compasses, entrenching tools, canteens, knives, rifles, machine guns, pistols, ammunition belts, first aid kits, and the Americans kept 2 parachutes, which is kind of odd because the mission was for the paratroopers to land, or I should say jump out of the planes anywhere from 300 to 500 feet from the ground. Not a lot of time to open up one parachute. And if your parachute had failed, the likelihood of being able to open the second one while you're catapulting to the ground at such a low altitude would have been unlikely. I should add that other soldiers brought additional supplies, additional knives and guns. One paratrooper that I read about brought some Schlitz beer with him to drink once they landed. The airborne route was fairly simple. The planes would take off from a number of airfields in central and southern England. They would fly across the English Channel, and there were certain points where there were naval vessels that would signal that they were on the right route and that they were heading in the direction of Normandy. And what's amazing about the flight from England and the whole operation with the airborne, but even the whole operation of Overlord and D-Day, is that the Germans had no idea that these planes were taking off. They had no idea that the landing craft were heading to the 5 beaches, and they were caught completely by surprise. A lot of this had to do with the fact that at this point in the war, the Allies had air superiority. Each of the planes and the sticks had designated air drop zones, and most of those were right in the heart of German territory where they had been occupying. The Germans had built up the Atlantic Wall. There were areas where along the beach there were the so-called Rommel asparagus, these tall wooden poles that would snag the gliders, Rommel being Erwin Rommel, the field marshal who was in charge of building and organizing the Atlantic Wall. Last minute check before boarding, the troops would line up. They basically used the buddy system. They would look at each other, make sure all of their equipment was there. The jump master, who is the individual standing over there, would also check, and then they would board the planes and they would hook up and get ready to take off at the designated time. Preceding the main body of the paratroopers were pathfinders. Pathfinders were essential. When the attack on Italy took place the year before in 1943, a number of the paratroopers landed far away from their drop zones. So the idea of the pathfinders is that they would arrive earlier. They were specially trained. You could volunteer as a paratrooper to be a pathfinder, and they arrived roughly 30 minutes before the main body of the paratroopers. And once they landed, they would set up navigational aids at the drop zones, things like compass beacons, colored panels, Eureka radar sets that had a short-range navigation system, and colored smoke. Eisenhower, well worth talking about. I am an unabashed Eisenhower fan. I think he was a great commander, and certainly, in my opinion, the best decision to lead SHAEF and to lead Operation Overlord. Because Lee Mallory had spooked him so much, telling him that he thought that about 80% of the paratroopers, give or take, might be shot out of the sky once they leave the C-47s, it was essential for Eisenhower to visit with some of these men. And he drove around the air bases. He specifically went to the RAF bases where the 101st Airborne was leaving from. And it wasn't because he was ignoring the 82nd. He had actually made a request through his staff to General Ridgway about visiting the 82nd, Ridgway respectfully declined, feeling that having Eisenhower there would be a distraction. So Eisenhower shows up. He walks around and famously talks to the men, asks them where they're from, asks them questions about their hobbies like fishing, asking them if they're nervous. Most of them told Eisenhower, "No, sir, we're not nervous. We are ready." In reality, it was Eisenhower who was nervous. He would have dinner with Maxwell Taylor and his staff that evening, and then he watched as every plane left Greenham Common, and then he went back to the circus tent. It's said by one of the war correspondents who was on the site, they turned to Eisenhower, and as he watched the planes, they could see tears rolling down his cheeks. The planes take off close to midnight on June the 5th and into the early morning hours of June the 6th. And the paratroopers, by and large, had similar experiences. They were scattered among Normandy's hedgerows, they were dropped into cow pastures, and they were dropped into villages and marshes. And the same thing happened to Ridgway and to Taylor. And it's important to note, in one of the themes of the book that this is based on, the Paratrooper Generals, which I wrote and was released in 2020, is that Ridgway and Taylor led from the front. They didn't have to drop with their paratroopers, but they chose to do so. And it's worth reading to you an account both of Taylor and Ridgway. Taylor would say when he landed that he struggled to get out of his parachute and he expected that some of his men would appear to help him once he got out of the chute and was on Normandy ground. But when he looked around, not a single American soldier was in sight. Only a circle of curious Norman cows, Taylor wrote in his memoirs, who eyed me disapprovingly, I thought, as if resenting the intrusion into their pasture. Taylor continued struggling to remove his chute, and when he heard German guns open up in the next field, he knew that he was in German territory. Ridgway wrote also about his account. He wrote that his descent was fast. He hit a nice, soft, grassy field, but he hit it hard. Ridgway nervously reached for his .45 pistol, but it slipped from his grasp, and he tumbled into the grass, he wrote. In the darkness, he pawed around for the weapon when he sensed a nearby movement. Ridgway called out the designated password, "Flash," and then anticipated what he hoped would be the response, which was thunder. But there was only silence. To his great relief, Ridgway realized the movement was from a cow. He would say, "I could have kissed her," he recalled, but it meant to him that the pasture was not mined or booby-trapped. Here are the famed crickets. These were actually developed for musicians, and they would snap and help keep time. Only the 101st Airborne carried these, and there's some question of how useful they were. In many cases, they probably likely fell out of a soldier's pocket. The 82nd Airborne landed in the area around the village of St. which was extremely important, off of a main road. The road was essential to be recovered. The village itself needed to be taken in order to get the troops off the beach. The battle for St. seesawed back and forth throughout June 6th and was partially secured at the end of the day, but not really until June 7th had the American 82nd Division taken the village. It's also famous for the famed church, which a paratrooper hung on there. Supposedly, there's some question about the story, and you can still see a dummy paratrooper hanging from the church should you visit St. today. The 101st Airborne liberated their area, which included Saint-Marie-du-Mont and Carentan. And this is where Robert Hillman's story comes in. Hillman, who I told you about early on, the paratrooper from Connecticut, whose mom packed his chute, who worked for the Acme Parachute Company, which was a real parachute company. He did land, just as he said, his chute opened, but he ended up breaking his leg. He would be out of the battle for the day, but he did recover, and he would go on to fight for during the rest of the war that the 101st Airborne was involved in. I learned a little bit about Hillman when I found one of his daughters, and I called her, cold called her. She was surprised. Nobody had ever asked her questions about her dad. Unfortunately, Private Hillman had a difficult time after the war. He had gone home. He had probably had a case of PTSD, raised a family, but did not remain with the family, left home, and could be seen around the town that they lived in Connecticut, taking on various odd jobs or riding his bike, but still wearing his proud paratrooper boots. So this is an overview that I've given you of the Airborne. And let's talk about some of the statistics. There were a little over 13,000 paratroopers of the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions. They were carried by 87 of the C-47 aircraft. 100 gliders flew into Utah Beach, including the one that killed General Pratt. There were roughly 3,900 glider troops, but the gliders also carried various supplies, jeeps, artillery, signal equipment, medical equipment. The planes themselves were flown by 5,700 United States Air Force's aircrew. 340 of the paratroopers or the airborne were killed on D-Day. As we know, the Normandy campaign was not just November 6th, but it continued on, at least for the paratroopers, through the middle of July. The actual Normandy campaign continued well into August. So a total of more than 1,000 airborne were killed. The airborne were turned into ground fighters, ground troops, just like the infantry. There were about 2,657 wounded, about 900 on D-Day. 4,400 or almost 4,500 went missing, about 1,200 on D-Day. We can assume that most of those were taken POWs. Because of their heroism, 3 paratroopers earned the Medal of Honor. So if you want to know more, I recommend a book that I wrote. It's called The Paratrooper Generals, where I look from the top and look at Matthew Ridgway and Taylor and the troops that they led on D-Day through the Normandy campaign involving the airborne, which was through July 13th. Now I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Are you in Annapolis? Where are you?
I am. I'm in Annapolis, Maryland, home of the U.S. Naval Academy, where I taught for a little bit some years ago. It's a cloudy morning here, a little bit chilly, but I'm excited to be here. And you got a great group of people who are obviously excited to learn about World War II, and you've had a fantastic lineup, and I'm glad to be part of it.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about the overall strategy of the airborne on D-Day. I'm something of a cynic when it comes to the sort of glorification of their role and impact. I'm kind of done with the sort of Band of Brothers view of the war. I mean, let's look at it. Was it that effective? The 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne. I don't want to start with a deliberately controversial question, but how effective were they really? Let's be really straightforward about this. Exactly how effective were they?
It's an excellent question, and I agree with you. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book of this nature, because like you, I've visited, and I'm sure many in the audience have visited the Normandy beaches on many occasions and kept hearing about the airborne. And of course, a lot of what we knew was based on, as you mentioned, Stephen Ambrose's book, The Band of Brothers. And I wanted to know why so many books have been written on the airborne, but in my opinion, nothing that really kind of tied their story together. Lots of individual stories like Band of Brothers. But getting to your point, I agree with you. I think the airborne troops were successful. They were a necessary component of Operation Overlord in the first day, which we call D-Day. But had the airborne been removed as part of the battle plan, well, the argument that was made by everyone from Omar Bradley to Montgomery to the Corps Chief Collins was, if we're going to land at Utah, which was essential in order to link up with Utah Beach, we have to have an invasion beforehand, and that would be by the airborne. If Utah was not part of the operation, would the day, a D-Day, have changed? Possibly, but it may have also been just as successful, and that's putting aside the mass casualties on Omaha Beach. So I kind of lean towards you in terms of a bit of cynicism. But as I started to write the book, and I mentioned this a few times at least in my presentation and certainly throughout the book, I wanted to know why do we know so much and why do we care so much about the paratroopers? And what I learned was the war correspondents had a significant a role in this. Guys like Wright Bryan, the reporter with the Atlanta Constitution, flies along with a stick of airborne, and he witnesses what happens, and he rushes back on the plane to London, and he gives this report. And then you had guys like Barney Oldfield, this wonderful war correspondent turned publicity guy, public affairs, and he gets other correspondents to drop in. So it almost creates this whole kind of story about D-Day. And in some ways, it's similar to another war that I've studied, and that's the First World War. Is why does Alvin York stand out as the hero? Well, he was an amazing guy, but the Army needed heroes. The War Department needed heroes to help kind of tell the story and to get the American people involved.
Uh, Talking about the 101st Airborne, the Battle of the Bulge is the deadliest battle of World War II for the US. It's more than a month long. It's a terrible crisis and a huge setback, arguably the biggest intelligence failure in US military history. I mean, certainly of World War II, I would argue, apart from Pearl Harbor. And yet, when people think about the Battle of the Bulge, they think about nuts,
Yeah.
McAuliffe saying nuts, and the heroic 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles that never needed to be rescued or relieved, that they could have fought against overwhelming odds for months more, etc. But the point is I think you make a very good point there, is that our view of these units and certain aspects of World War II is still influenced by the propaganda and press coverage back in World War II. 101st Airborne being the most the biggest beneficiaries of positive press coverage of any U.S. unit in World War II or since.
Yeah, I was just came back from a trip with Smithsonian Journeys, and you walk through some Mericles, and practically everyone, and I'm talking mostly about tourists, all are wearing Screaming Eagles caps, jackets, shirts. Yeah, they're the heroes of World War II, and some of that is helped, of course. And I want to give, even though he's somewhat of a controversial figure, Stephen Ambrose, certainly his due for making military history palatable and certainly making you and I and other authors allowed to publish in this area. But the photograph that he published showing Eisenhower talking to some of the men, the band of brothers, the 101st Airborne, really kind of created the story. And it's a fascinating photograph, and it's certainly as iconic as some of the other images. And yeah, the myth that, and I shouldn't say maybe a myth, but because we won't ever know, is that the 101st Airborne could have handled the entire Ardennes offensive by themselves is a great story. And
Yeah.
credit should be due to those brave men who jumped into Normandy and then learned how to fight as ground troops and were ready to relieve the other soldiers, their comrades who were trapped in the forest in December 44 and January 45.
We have a ton of questions, which I'm going to get to soon. But just on that note, I wanted to point out that, who's heard of the 99th Infantry Division, which, if you're going to pick one division during the Battle of the Bulge, did actually win the battle before the 101st Airborne really got going at Bastogne. When you showed the slide of the statistics, the first thing I thought was, I'm going to add up the casualties for the airborne divisions. And I'm reaching 8,000 from 13,100. So Lee Mallory wasn't too far off. I mean, 8,000 from 13,000 is over 50%. So Lee Mallory isn't that. He's 20% out, 30% out. Were you surprised when you look at that, when you looked at those casualty figures, just how high they were? 4,000 missing?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a startling number, but I think what's even more startling, at least to me, and having walked that ground, and I didn't talk about it much in this discussion, is the fact that so many of the paratroopers, both from the 82nd and the 101st, were dropped significant distance from the drop zones, the designated area. But the fact that they were able to cobble together literally and continue on and fight and reach most of their objectives on the first day and then be ready to fight through July. I mistakenly said November 6th. Of course, I meant June 6th. But yeah, the numbers are startling. But the fact that there were still enough troops and they were so heavily trained, so well prepared, and were able to regroup despite the fact that they were scattered hither and yon throughout the Normandy countryside. As I point out, they're near hedgerows, they're in apple orchards, they're scared, it's dark, and the the fact that they again regrouped and were able to fight that day and help in a way, getting the Fourth Division on shore is pretty miraculous, despite taking so many either killed, wounded, or captured by the Germans.
What explained the difference between the accuracy of the drops on D-Day and during Operation Market Garden for both divisions? Because if you look at the issues with D-Day, which basically came down to a very wide dispersal of troops being dropped, not many actually hitting their drop zones. In Market Garden in September of 1944, the 101st Airborne, it's over 90% are actually landing in their target zones. And what explains that massive improvement in accuracy of the drops?
Well, I think the weather played a significant role. I mean, it wasn't perfect in September of 44 over Holland. In fact, the Polish troops were delayed because of the weather. But I think there were lessons that were learned, and there was a significant amount of criticism, mostly after the war, of the pilots, the C-47 pilots who dropped the airborne into Normandy, that they weren't experienced, they didn't know what they were doing, they panicked because they were getting so much flack. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that these guys were just as brave as the paratroopers that were jumping from their planes, but the weather was horrible. It was a difficult assignment. You had radio silence, but I think when you get to Market Garden, the fact that they learned from this operation, just like Normandy, the D-Day learned in some ways from earlier paratrooper drops, whether it was in North Africa or Sicily or Italy.
Uh, I got a bunch of questions. Would Mitch, can you help me by let's just plow through these very quickly because we could
Sure. Yeah.
just snappy answers if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
First one is how accurate was the bell tower story in the Longest Day movie? And I'll jump in and say it's completely inaccurate. In fact, the image you showed of us of the dummy on the church at St.
Yeah.
Mary Lee's.
He's on the wrong side for one
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. But I love the Steele story. I mean, he was the toast of St. Mary Glees for 2 or 3 decades and didn't never had to buy a drink, which does explain some of the story that developed there. But uh, tell us a little bit about Steele and the bell tower incident.
Well, he like so many paratroopers, as I said a moment ago, just were dropped. Sam Merikles was actually on fire. It's unclear exactly what happened. It wasn't. There might have been a stray American bomb that dropped there or something. So a number of the paratroopers were actually illuminated as they landed. He went off course. There were, I think, two other paratroopers that allegedly landed on the church steeple there. We can thank Cornelius Ryan for the story, who I think was a wonderful writer in his trilogy, but he beefed up the Steele story, and as you say, Alex, he made him into a hero. And let's not forget, as great a movie as I believe The Longest Day is, it's a movie, and you have to tell the story. And Red Buttons portrays John Steele extremely well. But when I go over there with tour groups, I keep relatively mum because they want to see it. They want to get their photo opportunity. And of course, we'll never absolutely know for sure. There's one historian, Marty Morgan, who has, I think, climbed up there, and he concludes that there's no way that this could have happened. But it's a story, and I'm sticking with it.
There's another question here which I've kind of asked already, which is how successful was the overall mission? But Heidi does, thank you, Heidi, point out that we have a rather large number of British troops and Canadians landing around about the same time. Um, can you tell us a little bit about the coordination between the 6th Airborne and the American paratroopers? At a high level, did they talk to each other about, okay, you take the left flank, we'll take the right flank? Was there a high level coordination between those two units?
Not really. Not that I've been able to find. I mean, obviously, anything relating to Overlord, the planning, would have gone through Eisenhower and Eisenhower's staff. So he was aware of it, and certainly Ridgway and Taylor would have known about it, but it wasn't so much, we're going to cover this area and the swampy parts of Utah Beach, and you cover the British. It was almost like these were completely separate operations, and I've never seen anything where they all conferred, and so if that information is out there, I'm not aware of it.
Another question from Mike. How did the unintended dispersal of the paratroopers affect the German reaction to the invasion? And that's a really good question because one of the defenses for the overall airborne operation is that it did keep the Germans confused. There were so many troops were so badly dispersed.
I'm not hearing your vocals right now.
Oh,
Okay, but I think I got your question.
lucky you.
Yeah, no, no, you kind of answered it as well. It spooked the German troops. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but the original thought, according to Hitler, was that the Normandy attack, if it was going to happen, would be a diversion. The main attack would, of course, be at the Pas de Calais. So when these paratroops were coming in, I think some of the German troops who see that thought, well, are they dummy paratroopers? Are they real men? And they're landing all over the place. Basically, what's going on here?
Right. So we have two questions here, or rather statements. One's from Tim. Hi, Tim. He's traveled with us. Come on, guys. On D-Day, the troopers jumped at midnight, and Market Garden was during clear, sunlit skies over Holland. I forgot to state the obvious there, but that raises a very important question, which also somebody else has mentioned: the night drop versus the day drop. Should we have dropped in the day on D-Day? Should the whole airborne operation have occurred during the day?
I don't think so. I think the element of surprise, which I think would occur much easier or at least had a better chance of succeeding, had to be done while the skies are still dark and literally the Germans are caught sleeping. Had they waited during the day, I think Market Garden being a completely separate operation, it made a lot more sense for the troops to land while the sun is shining, as opposed to we need to get these men into Normandy without too many Germans knowing what's going on.
So tell us a little bit, finally, my last question about Ridgway and Taylor after the war, their post-war careers, because they were extremely successful, given they came from an airborne background, which was a new phenomenon within the US military. They went on to enjoy enormous success post-war.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were both Ridgway, for example, would continue with the airborne, but then he would take on the important role replacing Douglas MacArthur as commander of the United Nations forces in the Korean conflict, and both would end up being chiefs of staff of the army and having a significant influence. Taylor would also play an important role under the Kennedy administration in the early days of the Vietnam conflict. What's interesting to me, and I'm glad you asked this question, is when I was researching the book, Ridgway was a lot easier to research. First off, his autobiography is really good, and he goes into great amount of detail about being with the airborne. And then his personal papers are at in Carlisle at the U.S. Army Military History Institute, and they're very voluminous and easy to go through. Taylor, on the other hand, also wrote his autobiography, which is good, but he spends very little time on the airborne. And his papers, I hate to say it, are awful. They're held in Washington at the National Defense University, and there's very little in there to get insight into Normandy. And what I realized is in closing is that yes, it was a significant part of their careers, an essential part of their careers. But as you pointed out, they went on to do many other things, and it was just one aspect. And you don't get a tremendous, looking back on Normandy kind of thing of, well, I wish we had done this and wish we had done that.
Well, Mitch, what are you working on now? What's your next book?
I'm finishing up the draft of what I'm calling The Lion and the General, which is a study of narrative history of Churchill and Eisenhower's remarkable friendship. And just real quickly, what amazes me is that you have these two leaders, one who's an unknown general from the United States, and he's partnered with the leading political figure as the prime minister, and they develop this outstanding relationship, this outstanding friendship that I believe in biographies of both men is not touched upon. So I've had a lot of fun with that, and I think that'll be out sometime next year.
Okay, great. Well, we were one of our audience has already ordered your book, so you
Okay, excellent.
that you and on that note, you're very welcome to come back, and we'll sell even more books, more
I
of your
will.
books.
Once the Lion in the General is set for a release, I'll get in touch with you.
Yeah.
And I understand you're writing on Remagen. Have you finished that?
I am writing about it, and I haven't finished it.
Okay. I have an interesting story that I could share with you. I did a lecture for Smithsonian, and a veteran's father son told me a story about losing his father losing his watch in the river. If you're interested, I'll send
Oh
it.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, thank you, Mitch, for
Great.
spending this time with us. It's been a great session. Hope you'll rejoin us. A
Yeah,
wonderful, wonderful
absolutely. Thank
book.
you, Alex, and thanks everyone else for tuning in.